here, God says that submission is the first step on the pathway to spiritual maturity, and humility follows submission. See, you got to get the order here. Basically, humility is seen in submissiveness, and it leads to peacefulness. These are all connected in verses 5, 6, and 7. You can't jerk out the humble yourself in verse 6 without seeing 5 and 7. 5 says that humility starts with an attitude of submissiveness. And the submissiveness leads to humility, which issues into peacefulness. So humility is seen in submissiveness, and it leads to peacefulness. And peacefulness comes by humility and submission leads to humility and peace. And that sacred trio of spiritual maturity is what this whole epistle is about. And so what God is saying is this, that submission is the pathway to getting the grace to live this way. Look what it says in verse 5 again. We've read it over and over, but it says, likewise, you younger people, before we get to humility, look what it says, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. So submission is that pathway to the grace that's going to come in verse 6. But submission is that first spiritually mature attitude that must be ours. The first choice on the pathway to spiritual maturity is submissiveness. All believers submit to one another's God-designed roles because we all submit to God. That's what verse 5 says. God's answer is always we first submit to Him, and then we choose to clothe ourselves with humility. Jesus could lay aside his outer garments in the upper room and tie on the apron of the slave to wash the disciples' feet because he had already submitted, John 6:38, to do the will of his Father. Submission precedes the clothing with humility. And that's why a lot of people are never humble, because they're never submissive. The pride that keeps them unsubmissive to anybody telling them what to do is what precludes them from the grace that comes through clothing ourselves with humility. Only God's grace can enable us to submit to other believers, to submit to ungodly governments, and to work authorities we don't like. But when we do, God makes all grace abound toward us as we submit.